We move on to question number 13, Business Data Analytics, December 2022, which reads, a data breach occurs when the organization's data suffers a security incident resulting in a breach of confidentiality, availability, or integrity. According to the applicable data protection law, in the case of a data breach, the organization should A, notify the supervisory authority within 48 hours of the incident whether or not it poses a risk to the organization and affected individuals. B, notify the supervisory authority within 48 hours of the incident only if it poses a risk to the organization and affected individuals. C, notify the supervisory authority within 72 hours of the incident whether or not it poses a risk to the organization and affected individuals. D, notify the supervisory authority within 72 hours of the incident only if it poses a risk to the organization and individuals. Now, candidates, in my view, this question is a bit ambiguous. The question is testing a candidate's knowledge on data breach. And the question why I say it's ambiguous is because in case of data breach, organizations have to follow applicable data protection laws and regulations which may require the organization to notify the relevant authorities of the incident. And the specific requirements for notification may vary depending on the jurisdiction and the nature of the breach. This question is not specific, is not giving the candidate the jurisdiction. We have data protection in different countries, different nationalities, different regions. The question is ambiguous because it's not easy to tell whether the examiner is testing the candidate's knowledge on data protection law in Kenya or elsewhere. Because a country may have 48 hours, another one 72 hours of notifying the supervisory authority. Another one may have 50 hours. So it depends with the jurisdiction. The question is open, so it's not easy to tell whether it's testing the data protection in Kenya or not. But going by the language that is used within the question, the language, for example, of the term supervisory authority, this is not the language that is used in the Data Protection Act in Kenya. The term supervisory authority is used in the General Data Protection Regulation, which is a data protection law that applies in the European Union and the European Economic Area. And according to the General Data Protection Regulation, that is the GDPR, an organization or organizations are required to notify the supervisory authority or the data protection agency of a data breach without undue delay, where possible, not later than 72 hours after having become aware of it. All right? That is, if the examiner was testing on the general protection, the General Data Protection Regulation used in European Union, that is the position of that law. All right? But in case of the Data Protection Act in Kenya on the notification and communication of breach, The term used in the Kenya law, data protection law, is not supervisory authority, but is data commissioner. Where a personal data has been accessed or acquired by an authorized person and there is a risk of harm to the data subject whose personal data has been subjected to the unauthorized access, a data controller is required to notify the data commissioner without delay within 72 hours of becoming aware of it. All right? And candidates, I would advise you to familiarize yourself with the Data Protection Act of Kenya, because that is where you are most likely to practice. But for the purposes of answering this question, the answer is D, which reads, notify the supervisory authority within 72 hours of the incident only if it poses a risk to the organization and individuals. Because the GDPR reads that in the case of a personal data breach, the controller shall, without undue delay and where feasible, not later than 72 hours, having become aware of it, notify the personal data breach to the supervisory authority competent in accordance with the law, unless the personal data breach is unlikely to result in a risk to the rights and freedoms of natural persons. The key word there is unless the personal data breach is unlikely to result in risk. Unless, I repeat, the personal data is unlikely. That means only if it poses a risk to the organization. Only if it poses a risk to the organization and individuals, the supervisory authority is required to be notified within 72 hours of breach. So that is the answer according to the General Data Protection Regulation as used in the European Union and the European Economic Area. So this question ought to have read, a data breach occurs when the organization's data suffers a security incident resulting in a breach of confidentiality, availability, or integrity, according to the General Data Protection Regulation. That is, the proper wording should have been according to the General Data Protection Regulation, and not just to read according to the applicable protection law. Because as I said earlier, many jurisdictions, many countries have their own applicable law. So it was not clear in this question whether the examiner is testing the GDPR or the Data Protection Act in Kenya, or the data protection in Rwanda, or the data protection in Tanzania, and so on. But going by the wordings in the question, it is quite clear the question tested the candidate's knowledge on the General Data Protection Regulation, which understandably, because it's understandable because most of the data protection laws in countries like Kenya, the Data Protection Act in Kenya borrows heavily from the General Data Protection Regulation, because the Kenyan law was enacted recently in 2019, so there is a lot of borrowing from the European Union and the European Economic Area. So the answer here is D. That is question 13, Business Data Analytics, December 2022.